Welcome to the Professional Women's Wellness Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Peggy Gleason, creator of the Mindful Eating Approach, where I help professional women and business owners with a tailored path to weight loss and self-confidence without the stress of restrictive diets, time-consuming exercise regimes, or medications. I help you transform your eating habits to enhance all areas of your wellness. And we always offer inspiration, motivation, and education with amazing gifts. I'm Dr. Peggy Gleason, your host, and today we have a really, truly special guest who's going to shed light on a topic that's not only fascinating, but critical for your health yet often overlooked, the power of functional testing and genetics. And oh my gosh, I can't wait to hear what Dr. Sam Shay is going to teach us. Dr. Shay is a chiropractor and a functional medicine practitioner who solves health puzzles. And he usually works with health conscious moms, mompreneurs, and I believe Asperger's
Adults on the spectrum, yeah.
adults with Asperger's. Yeah. He helps them leave the survival mode and transition into the community. He does so many things for people today. So he's also known as the lab nerd, which cracks me up. He specializes in functional lab and genetics analysis for data-driven results. Dr. Shay, this is so cool. He's also a stand-up comic using clean observational comedy to educate and entertain. So today he's going to focus on a practical guide for the most efficient, accurate, and effective tools for professional women. So a warm welcome to you, Dr. Shay.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Peggy. Appreciate it. So I wanted to share the focus of today would be on genetics and food cravings and understanding what a genetic optimal diet actually is and how it relates to everyone's individual struggles around food cravings. Now, just a bit of my backstory around food cravings. I was a sugar addict growing up, and that was kind of a convergence of multiple factors. I grew up, I had very bad health problems starting at age 6. From my earliest memories, I was sickly, and it stemmed originally from my parents having a nuclear divorce where me and my sisters were caught in the blast radius, and they did everything wrong about how to handle a divorce. There was lots of blaming, weaponizing the kids against the other parents. The children were not informed that it wasn't their fault. It's just it wasn't handled well at all. And then you combine that with a really I call it a gilded education. It was a good education academically, but a very terrible education socially. A lot of violence in school, and no one was protecting me from any of it. Not the teachers, not my parents, nothing. And they knew it was going on. It was in full daylight view. So I emotionally coped with sugar, also video games and television. And so I had a sugar addiction, a video game addiction starting at age 6. I had severe insomnia. It actually stunted my growth. I had crippling insomnia for about 10 years. And digestive problems, lots of anxiety, depression, gut problems. It was not fun. It wasn't a good experience. And so I was supposed to be the 3rd generation medical doctor, but instead I pivoted into natural medicine because I realized that my 2 psychiatrist parents, that's true, they were not interested in any biological causes. It was all in my head, and their answers were just drug me into submission.
Oh,
And
goodness.
so I took a different path, and I later realized that there were other components influencing my sugar cravings and sugar addiction outside of just mere emotional anesthesia. And those other components were 1, genetic, and 2, metabolic. And the genetic component is a thing we'll focus on this point, and we can talk about the metabolic in another discussion. The what I realized is that when I learned about genetics and got very, very heavy into genetics, I started really into genetics about 8 years ago, and since then, really dove deep into it, and I'm basically creating an entire ecosystem of support around to help people with genetics the way that it's helped me. So one of the many things that genetics revealed to me was one, uh, how do I determine my ideal diet? Because I was craving sugar because genetically I crave sugar. Like, and for people to understand, like, well, why would you genetically crave sugar? Some people crave sugar more than others, and there's a reason for that. I look back to evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology to get the answers to most mysteries if it doesn't make sense otherwise. So, for example, um, I was literally writing up a talk on um I was literally writing up a talk for a webinar on the genetics of sugar craving. And I got an email from my local natural grocery store, Natural Grocers, that they were giving away a free organic chocolate bar if you came in today or tomorrow for Mother. It was on Mother's Day, I think. And and I was it couldn't have been timed better. I'm literally writing an email on the genetics of sugar craving, and I cannot get this specter of this chocolate bar dancing in my head, out of my brain. I just couldn't do it. And so what I realized is very kind of meta experience is that, oh, people who genetically crave sugar have a stronger impulse to aggressively forage. Now, modern day foraging is getting in the car and going to the grocery store and running down the aisles and making sure I get that free chocolate bar. But the impulse, how the impulse manifests, is not as important as noticing the impulse to go forage. And that's why genetically some people are wired to forage more than others, because they will, on balance, get more calories for themselves and hopefully share a little bit with the tribe for others. But the problem is that if everyone's constantly on this kind of manic foraging thing, then you can have a tribal breakdown of this kind of the solipsistic foraging of like everyone's out for themselves. And also I got super distracted writing my genetics thing on thing. I got distracted by sugar writing my thing on the genetics of sugar craving. Like, isn't that hilarious? So um so so it makes sense why genetically some people will crave more sugar than others. Now, some people think, well, okay, well, if you genetically crave sugar, does that mean we're in some sort of fatalistic downward spiral that, oh, wait, I crave sugar, might as well give up now and just pass the M&Ms. Here we go. That's not the power of understanding your genetics. So when I run genetics on people, I only run genetics that are actionable and helpful. I get it. Some people really want to know what percentage Irish they are. That's super important to them. That's not my interest at all. So I'm focusing on just on the 100 or so genes that are strictly related to optimal health. That's it. The genealogy stuff, cool, awesome. That's you do that with someone else. So, but what the genes that are chosen are ones that are practical, meaning that every gene that's selected is something that you can do to change the epigenetics. Epigenetics is how your environment and lifestyle influence the expression of the genes. The genes do not change, their expression changes. Genes are like a dial, and then certain people have certain ranges on their dial or certain ranges available. Like, so if someone has a bad, quote unquote, bad copy of a gene, they get access to this much. If they're a yellow dot then they get access to this. If they're a green dot, they get access to this. Lifestyle determines if you're at this end or this end. So if you're a green dot and you have a terrible lifestyle, you can careen into red territory. And if you're a red dot and you do a really good lifestyle, you can move into expressing like a green dot. But the default, it will always come back to its default setting unless you have a lifestyle change to shift it otherwise. So the green dots have a default that's better off, but through by choice or circumstance, they can have a bad lifestyle and go back into red territory. And the reverse is also true. So just because someone has, quote, bad genes like I got tons of bad genes. I have the second worst gene profile I've done in the past 8 years. I've run it on people. I was only dethroned a summer and a half ago from gold medal, terrible gene profile.
Oh, goodness.
So I've had mixed feelings about that. I thought I was gold medalist, but evidently I'm a silver medalist now in my own practice, whatever. Um, so but the genes are empowering. So the way that you deal with sugar craving genes is that you never force your willpower, you change your environment. So if I know that I crave sugar and its associates, including things like bread and processed grains and all the rest of it, I am not stronger than bread. I am smarter than bread. So I will not buy bread.
Right.
And that way, if I go and just fidget check the fridge to see if there's anything, bread-like substance, and I check, 30 minutes later after first, nope, still not there. Nope, didn't manifest. Nope, didn't just materialize out of nothing. It's not there. So I just give up because it's not within reach. And I realize for some people this is not easy, because if you have families and other people have different dietary preferences, or we'll just pick like bread's easy for, like, even if it's like gluten-free, organic, keto, raised by left-handed monks and picked on the last harvest moon, whatever. Bread can be very, very convenient, understandably, for families, super convenient. But you may have a problem with it, but the rest of your family doesn't have a problem with it, but they need it and you need it to help them, or whatever the culinary arrangement is. So I understand that this is not as simple as just say, don't buy the thing, particularly other people to consider. But the concept is still of value, where you can know that you focus on controlling your willpower, not your environment. That's one example around how to deal with cravings in genetics. I'll just kind of pause there, just kind of shared a bunch, and love to, if you have any feedback or questions or anything.
I love the fact that you're saying, and what I'm understanding is it's not your willpower, but I mean, you have the willpower, but it's best to.
It's harder. It's much harder to control
harder.
willpower. Just harder.
Right.
Much harder.
But if you change your environment, that works.
Yes. Yeah. Then
Right.
you're basically making it hard for you to fail.
Yeah.
That's you're increasing the friction to succumbing to whatever craving or addiction you're dealing with.
So, for instance, if somebody's has that craving and they're staring in that refrigerator for something that they want and it's not there, if they just decide, you know what, I think I'm going to work on a puzzle, and just change what they're focusing on, that would help.
So it can. So addiction and cravings there's a lot of
okay. Yeah.
A craving versus an addiction actually has technical differences. So
okay.
A craving is technically it's a nutritional deficiency. An addiction is emotional anesthesia. So the metabolic, the metabolic thing is we'll talk about more in detail on their next chat, but it's like cravings are the body is approximating, the body needs a specific nutrient, and it has this association with a specific food or food-like substance to the nutrients it's needing. So for example, the human eye evolved with a couple real key distinguishing features. Number one, it's to detect the patterns of snakes in the lower field of vision. That's real. Wow. That we are uniquely adapted to detect snake patterns in the lower field of vision. Number two is to detect the color of ripe fruit at a distance. And the coevolution of humans and fruit-bearing trees is the following. The tree is basically pumping, is the fruit is the tree's ways to propagate. But the fruit isn't ready until it's fully ready till it's ready. So what happens is that the fruit itself is bitter and not brightly colored until the very last stages, where the tree then flushes the fruit with sugar and nutrients and changes the color of the skin to signal fruit-eating mammals that, hey, here's the deal. the tree, will give you sugar, water, minerals, and vitamins in exchange for you eating me and hopefully not mashing up all the seeds, but some seeds will maintain intact and will pass through your digestive system, and you will be far away from me, the mama tree, and poop out whole seeds with a fresh pile of fertilizer somewhere far away to then grow another tree. That's the deal.
Okay.
That's the deal. So
Yeah.
we get nutrition and calories and so on. They get a vector to send their potential progeny far away with fertilizer to boot.
That is so awesome.
So what happens is that when people, sometimes metabolically, when people are craving sugar as a craving, they're not craving sugar. They're craving minerals and vitamins that were water that was packaged with sugary fruit.
Wow.
So it's not an addiction. I mean, you look at women who are pregnant and they're like eating dirt and like having like 6 gallons of Ben and Jerry's ice cream and they never touched it before. Like they're not there. There is no Ben and Jerry's deficiency in the genealogical tree back through million years of evolution. That's not a thing. But what is a thing? But what is a thing is the nutrients in fat and sugar that are needed to help gestate a fetus. So, and minerals in dirt, like it's so that's the metabolic side of it. And there's other things in more detail like mitochondrial function, all the rest we can go into a bit more detail later on. But that's a snippet of how there's cravings and then there's addiction, which is emotional anesthesia. Then there's the genetic mediator between them. And so when people have stronger genetic dials, like the genes will either amplify or dampen the craving / addiction.
Okay.
It's that dial. Depending on where your switch is at, the genes will amplify or dampen the signal. So if you know your genes, then you can control your environment better, more than just sugar craving. Like there's a bunch of stuff that we can talk about in terms of genes and diet and cravings and addictions. So that's how I would bookmark craving and addiction technically.
I like the way you separated them. And what really you explained so beautifully is if people are craving sugar, it's really because they're nutrient deficient in minerals, water, and some of the things.
Sometimes that's the reason.
Okay.
So people can be craving sugar because it's an emotional anesthetic. It's like,
yeah.
They can be craving it because genetically they're vulnerable to it. They could be craving it metabolically for several reasons. One is they're craving a specific mineral or nutrient. They've got an underlying metabolic disease like type 2 diabetes or something where their actual sugar signaling systems or the insulin control or their mitochondria are damaged and they can't properly burn fats and proteins in the mitochondria for energy. So they're left with burning sugar in another pathway inefficiently, but it's the only thing they can do. So, and they can also be craving sugar for, I mean, it is metabolic, but if they're under, like the sickest population of people I've ever worked with as a population have been night shift nurses.
Oh, I can relate to that one.
Yeah, night shift nurses, and it's the primary differentiator between the primary variable is this absolutely insane human Tetris they play with night shift nurses' sleep and their routines.
Absolutely.
I mean, and on top of like all the indoor bright fluorescent lights, all the stress from being yelled at from doctors half your age to administration your age to the patients and to the family members of the patients, usually the worst in terms of just static, all the toxic chemicals you're exposed to, all the physical injuries from moving patients that are difficult or are involuntary difficult or paraplegic or whatever the challenges are. And then there's every nurse that I know has their heart on their sleeve with an open vein just bleeding out,
Mhm.
heart on their sleeve, emotionally giving everything to themselves. And then they're on this crazy sleep schedule. And then they have to stay awake and cope in this high stakes environment with sugar and caffeine. And like, it's just a massive setup for catastrophic health failure.
Oh my gosh, I so relate to this. I had been a critical care nurse for most of my career,
Okay, right.
and
There you go.
you just nailed it. And when I worked night shift, and I guess I was not somebody that would indulge in the stuff people bought in. It just wasn't my thing. I like to keep busy. But what I was noticing is the weight gain of night nurses.
Yeah,
And to me, it was like they were just trying to stay awake, eating all the junk food that people brought in. It's like
correct.
going to the nurses' lounge, and it was like cookies, donut, a lot of
It was
sweet.
Halloween. It was just Halloween every day. Yeah, it's Halloween.
Yeah, and and you're right. The demands that they have is ridiculous. I always call nurses are on a, a eat and go diet all their
Exactly.
lives.
And that's where the sugar crave. So you think of all these different variables that have
Yes.
just converged on night shift nurses and sugar cravings. Some of them have the genetic predisposition, which isn't helping. Then they've got all the stress. Then they've got their adrenal circadian rhythms are completely whacked out because of all the night
Mm.
shift nursing and everything like that. Then they've got all the stress from, doctors half their age, administration,
Yeah.
patient, and their families. Then it's a high stakes of what can happen to the patient. Then you've got all the toxic exposure that's then affecting their mitochondria,
Mm.
and
Mm.
which then and on and on and on and on and on and on. And then you've got the inflammatory component of your genetics, which we haven't even discussed about yet. So some people
Uh,
genetically are hyper inflamers. And so with people who are hyper inflamers, what I call the they have what I call the muffin test. Um, and if you can enable screen share, I'll just show
oh,
what.
sure, sure. I would love to see that. I forgot to put that screen share on. There you go.
Thank you. So the muffin test is a test I came up with, and the it's basically, if you eat a half muffin, do you gain 1 to 3 pounds? Now, unless that muffin was last year's regifted Christmas fruitcake, it did not weigh 1 to 3 pounds, right?
That's right, right.
So what's happening here? It's that you're triggering an inflammatory response, which then causes the body to retain water. It's water weight. You're not gaining calorie weight. You're gaining
Hmm.
inflammatory water weight because that muffin, it's like, it's the sugars, it's the gluten, it's the preservatives, it's the dough conditioners, it's the colorings, it's the chemicals, whatever it is. The inflammation is damages cells, and so the body will dilute the inflammatory chemicals by retaining water in the interstitia, which is a fancy way of saying the water in between the cells to stop
Yeah.
the inflammatory chemicals from touching the cells. And so this is where people put on inflammatory weight. Now, genetically, some people are more prone to this than others. And so you have people that can crave sugar, put on weight from the inflammatory response,
Hmm.
then either emotionally feel bad that they just ballooned up and then eat more sugar because they feel bad and that just perpetuates the problem, or they try to punish themselves with starving and then over exercising, which then can create another inflammatory response. And then, so I actually lectured at genetics conferences on exercise induced obesity.
Oh my goodness, that had to be fascinating.
Yeah, well, it's demoralizing for
Oh my
people who
God, but just
exercise
to
the Saturday.
understand it.
Yeah, to understand it, when you
Oh,
explain it out to people, it's like it's not about calories; it's about inflammation. There's a certain subset of the population which I identified genetically. Just looked at their specific genetics on inflammation, on liver detox, specifically as inflammatory genes around the liver, like the CRP genes, for example.
mhm.
Um, that there was a certain population that they had a very narrow line between the benefits of exercise and over exercising. Like, it's a very short distance from helpful and then just a little bit more, just a little bit too much. Then they crossed over into pro-inflammatory, net pro-inflammatory. So what happened is that these people, the more they exercise, the fatter they get, but it's a different type of fat. It's this kind of puffy weight that washes out the muscle tone. It's like this kind of ruddy, watery. It's water weight. It's water weight. And the more they exercise, the more washed out their muscles look. And it's not, and so it becomes this vicious cycle. I got to exercise more. I got to exercise more. No, it's not about exercising more. It's about exercising smarter and allowing for more recovery and putting yourself on the appropriate anti-inflammatory diet, lifestyle, and nutrients according to your specific gene combinations around what genes are inflammatory, which inflammatory genes, which liver detox genes, which vitamin D receptor, like there's a combination of genes to look at that then can get very granular and specific around inflammatory weight gain. And just to top it off, you have people who are histamine sensitive who put on inflammatory water weight that way. And then that relates to sugar cravings because, again, like I mentioned, the emotional component, the emotional component, and then if you over exercise, then you're going to crave more calories to compensate everything you just chewed through. So you can create this sugar craving metabolic thing that's, again, amplified by the genetics.
Oh my gosh, it's a cycle.
Yeah. And histamine, just a note on histamine, so there's antihistamine diets are very popular these days for good reason. I will just, spoiler alert, putting people on antihistamine diet is by far been the hardest thing I've ever done dietarily with anybody. Have you experienced this?
No, but I think the audience might want to know, what is an antihistamine diet?
So an antihistamine diet is, I can literally just scroll down to.
I'm sure everybody's curious.
So the problem with a lot of quote unquote healthy foods are high in histamine, like avocado. You tell a Californian they can't have avocado, they will lose their mind.
Yes, they will.
Lose their mind. So there's a lot of quote healthy foods that are high in histamine. So the things that people should watch out for. The reason this is on here is because genetically you can test for for histamine tolerance. Some people are overproducers of histamine. Some people are underproducers of histamine. And if you look at genetically, why would anyone have value in being a high histamine producer? It's the same, again, evolutionary biology answers all these mysteries, including hyperinflamers like me. Of the top 50, I test of the 110 or so genes that I test for, 15 of them are explicitly the most important genes for inflammation. The higher up, there's hundreds of genes that are related to inflammation directly or indirectly, but I look at the tippy top 15 that mobilize all the others. I have 13 out of those 15 have negative genetic variants. Okay, so I'm a hyperinflamer. And so inflammation, so we'll talk about inflammation and histamine in the exact same evolutionary biological context. You need inflammation to live, but too much of it, or it's out of control, or it's dysregulated, you'll die. Histamine, if you have too much of it, you'll get anaphylaxis and die like that. But you need some, or you'll die from other things like venom. I believe histamine is the body's defense against venom. So if you're a hunter-gatherer and there's a spider bite, snake bite, scorpion, centipede, some plants have their own version of things. You get the hives or whatever, insects, wasps, bugs, whatever. They inject venom into your system, and histamine is the flood switch to drown the area in water to do what? Dilute the venom so the venom doesn't corrode or erode muscles, tissue, and really bad venom bone, arteries, veins, etc. So it makes total sense when you describe it as like it's the flood switch to dilute venom. Everyone I've ever talked to is like, oh, that's super smart of the body. Problem, if you have an overreactive histamine response, you can overflood, and then you can choke off the very arteries, nerves, veins, and blood flow, etc., to you're trying to stop venom one way, but you disable the body or threaten the body in another way if you do too much. So the evolution, nature does not care one bit about you as an individual. It only cares about the success of the lineage. So with sexual reproduction and genetic recombination, what happens is that nature figured out a way that you just keep throwing into the next generation. This person's a bit over histamine. This one's a bit on the average. This one's a bit less. And because over time, with the change of environment, you're going to survive. One of those is going to survive, or more. Some of those are going to survive. And because of genetic recombination through sexual reproduction, you're going to keep getting these variations in your progeny to adapt to the environment as the environment changes. So it's the same. So it's the same thing with inflammation, that I'm a hyperinflamer. Why in the world is that a benefit? It's a benefit in another environment. As a hyperinflamer, I am optimally suited. I'm even built like it. I'm optimally suited to be a tip of the spear hunter. Like I'm built to sprint. Like I am a sprinter. I am not a jogger. I have very high capacity ballistic movements. I can move very fast, but I have a short resilience, and that may be due to the Lyme disease I'm dealing with also, which is a whole separate story. Another cause of sugar cravings. Fun fact. So, and infections would cause sugar cravings for other reasons we'll talk about another time. So
there's so many things you're mentioning that are blowing me away because and I'm sure the audience is listening to this, that how would you ever know this information?
Genetics.
No one talks about it. I mean, you're the first expert to ever say, hey, this is where it came from, Oh my gosh, it's amazing.
So the inflammation, when I read my genetic report, I cried for an hour. I sobbed for three reasons. One, I finally understood why I was so sickly growing up, given everyone else around me seemed to be like way better off. Number two, the genes that I ran were practical, so I had a plan going forward. I knew what to do. And in my case, I had crippling joint pain in my wrist, like I was a chiropractor. Like it was in a lot of pain. I had pain like an old man. And I realized because I'm a hyperinflamer and my inflammation shows up in my joints, not as water weight. You get different kind of some technical reasons why that is for me in particular. But and I was able to deal with my joint pain through doing the genetics recommendations because it was a different set of recommendations than, say, from doing like an adrenal test or a mitochondria test. It was a genetic issue I had to address, and my joint pain went away. The third reason that I cried was that I forgave my body. I forgave it because I realized it was mismatched to the environment that I was born into. Genetically, I'm ideally suited to be a hunter-gatherer in a tip-of-the-spear hunting party because the point of inflammation is to heal damaged tissue and kill infections. That's the point. So if I'm trying to take down, using only a tiny stick, a giant animal that has hooves, horns, teeth, claws, whatever, there's a very high chance that me with my tiny stick, I'm going to get bit or mauled or gored or trampled or whatever. So if I'm bit, what is that? That's tissue damage plus the injection of pathogens from what's in the mouth of the animal that just bit me. So now I have this exuberant inflammatory response, which means that I will more likely survive a short-term bite wound than my less inflammatory prone hunting party member. Right?
Okay, right.
That's
very interesting because you're highly, what do you call it? Inflammation?
Hyperinflamer.
Hyperinflamer, yes. Because of that, you have an advantage of surviving some of these things that other people may die from, basically.
Correct. So right. What I get in the short-term benefit, I lose in the long-term benefit, and it's reversed for people that have are less inflammatory prone. They're a greater risk in the short term, but will survive better in the long term. Again, it's that variability I talked about
Oh,
that it's just going to
yeah.
help you the lineage wants the lineage to survive. It doesn't care about you. It just cares about the lineage. So with histamine, again, the body's flood switch to deal with venom. My theory, I'm open to others, but this is the one that makes the most sense to me. There's three ways histamine can get into your body. One is you have high histamine foods like alcohol, avocados, chocolate. Sorry, ladies, you know. Uh, by the way, this is true. Whenever I ran food intolerance panels, women, the very first thing they would flip to see if it was chocolate. For men, the very first thing they would flip to see if they could not eat red meat.
Oh,
Isn't that
no.
interesting? I
Oh,
just saw it
my
over and over
goodness.
again.
That's interesting.
So you have foods that contain high histamine, alcohol, avocado, beans, pulses, chocolates, eggplants, long stored nuts, mature cheeses, pickled canned foods, vinegars, ready to eat meals, salty snacks, vegan meat, the kind of seitan, shellfish, smoked meats, preserved foods. So that directly introduces histamine. So if you eat this high histamine food, remember, it's the flood switch. And like if a bee stings your arm and your arm swells up, the bee did not inject a half quart of water into your arm. That's not a thing. It's the venom, and then the body responded with the big quart of water, and you swelled up.
Yeah.
So if you eat these high histamine foods, you're basically introducing into your digestive tract a systemic, slow-moving bee sting that then you will now retain water and swell. So that's what histamine does when people eat these things and they're genetically sensitive to histamine. Then there's foods that increase what's called endogenous or internally generated histamine, because your body makes its own histamine, again, to have it in reserve to deal with any prospective venom. So there's foods that increase histamine production in the body: bananas, chocolate, citrus fruits, kiwi, legumes, mushrooms, papaya, peanuts, pineapple, plums, tomatoes, vinegars, walnuts, wheat germ. And then there's foods that block the enzyme the body has to break down histamine. So there's an enzyme called HistDAO, and you need this enzyme to break down histamine so you can not just be constantly stimulated by it and keep swelling up with water. But foods can block that enzyme. So alcohol, black tea, caffeine, energy drinks, and green tea will all do that. So now I've read off a bunch of foods that a lot of people love. Like, well, I thought green tea was good for me. I thought chocolate, and bananas and avocado. No, not avocado, never avocado. Like, it's harder for people to wrap their head around a low histamine diet. And so for people that are struggling, getting your genes tested, you may not like the answers. I'm sensitive to histamine. If I eat too much chocolate, I get headaches. I get itchy skin. It's not fun. So getting your genetics back doesn't mean it's always pleasant, but my North Star is what is the truth, and I'd rather know the truth than be in denial. And there's so for knowing your genes, you can directly control your diet. And even better, there's actually genetic testing now available where you can determine if you're keto, Mediterranean, high carb, or paleo. Like
wow, that would help so many people.
That's the thing. Like, so you can, it's a different type of test. It's called copy number analysis. And you can't get that from a 23andMe or an Ancestry or any of these other companies like DNA Life or whatever. They're checking for variations, which is what we were talking about with like histamine and inflammation, like your green, red dot, good copy, a bad copy, a media, in between copy, whatever. We're talking about duplicates. So the gene in question is the gene that makes amylase in the saliva of and the metaphor that I like to use is like, imagine your digestive system is a fort, and you've got these carb Vikings or the Visigoths or whatever. They're charging the fort, and you're lining the fort with cannons. And the variation of the gene is what type of cannon it is like, is it a cannon that shoots out to 100 things per minute, or um 95 or 90? So the variation between the cannon types is very little significance between 90, 95, 100. Just making these numbers up to illustrate a point, because the
Sure.
research shows the variation of this gene doesn't really matter. It's the duplicates that matter. So if you imagine, if I have one cannon that's a perfect 100 bullets per minute, it's very different than if I have 9 red cannons that are 90 bullets each. So do you see, or 10? Say I have 10. I would rather have 10 red cannons than one green cannon.
Right.
900 versus 100. So it's the duplicates that matter. And for the super gene nerds out there, it's basically the start codon and the stop codon. In between are the duplicates of this gene. So whenever you hit the go button to make this enzyme, all of those duplicates are coded. So you linearly generate whatever number of copies you have is however many multiples more of that enzyme you got. So people that have low numbers of these cannons are better suited for paleo, and the really lowest for keto. And then you've got the moderate levels are more in the Mediterranean range, and you got the higher levels are high carb. Now, for me, I was eating a perfect Portlandia Mediterranean diet in terms of carb. Like I knew my farmers, I knew the names of their chickens, the quinoa was raised by, it's just like, it's all organic, local, blah, blah. And when I did my genetics, I realized I had the second lowest carb tolerance possible. I was eating, it wasn't a quality of carb issue, it was a quantity of carb issue.
Okay.
And I switched my diet to paleo borderline keto, and digestive problems went down massively. Like I had like for the first time in my life, I had like no digestive problems. And it was because I was overeating carbs. Not that the carbs weren't good. It's good quality. It's just too much for me to handle. I had these wild swings in energy. I started to modulate. Gas went way down. And I was just eating in a way that wasn't appropriate for my genes. Now, my ancestry, like, it comes from the much northern latitudes of like the Eastern European area. Not a huge amount of grains growing up there over the 100, 2,000 years ago, or 100, so, or even 10,000 years ago. So it makes sense that as a lower carb number, I was a much lower carb number because it was more of a hunting culture than an agrarian culture. So, and you see populationally different numbers on average based on people's heritage. This is where heritage is interesting. It's not guaranteed that you're going to be a certain number based on your heritage, but it does relay certain things. So people who came from a more agricultural background in the past 10,000 years have on average much higher copy numbers. And people who genetically did not grow up with agriculture in the past 5, 10,000 years have way, way lower copy numbers. So once you know your genetics of your carb tolerance, that changes everything about your meals. So like what the ratios of your meals. So that's enough. And in terms of sugar cravings, bringing it back to sugar cravings,
right.
If I'm eating outside my genetic tolerance for carbs, my blood sugar control is going to be all over the place.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So
how do I'm so anxious to see, how do you manage your clients? You test their genes, or do you test everything?
So
what's the process for them to know what kind of food they should eat?
I think so having over the years I've been doing this, I've come to the following conclusions, and I'll show you I have a surprise. I have a graphic for it.
Yay.
Me being all nerdy and stuff. Okay. So this is I designed this as the 5 layers of your ideal diet. This is my own creation. This is the real food pyramid, by the way. So at the base are people's genetics. So the
Right.
genetics of your carb tolerance, the genetics of your food triggers, like histamine, like for me also the 10% of the people listening to this have quote caffeine-induced anxiety and depression,
Oh,
like me.
wow. That's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, if I could tell you what, when I lecture in front of a group of
Oh, my
entrepreneurs,
goodness.
when I lecture to entrepreneurs and say 10% of you have caffeine-induced anxiety and depression, you can hear the collective sphincter of the crowd just clench because they're so terrified. Like, my company runs on coffee. No, they're just terrified. So, um, so the trigger foods that I look for are you reactive to lactose in milk? Do you have this gluten, a risk of celiac? Looking at caffeine-induced anxiety and depression, looking at histamine tolerance, other food allergens, alcohol tolerance, salt. Oh, by the way, salt is not just about blood pressure. I see if people have high salt sensitivity, but they don't have high blood pressure, they usually have water retention.
Yes,
Another
yes.
source of water retention is the salt thing. Um, the genetics of diet is also your food behaviors. So we talked about your relationship to sugar craving. There's other food genes that are tested for as well, like general satiation, like people who don't feel full genetically, because fullness is not in the stomach, it's in the brain. It's a signal
Without
from
a
the
doubt.
stomach to
Without
the
a
brain.
doubt.
So some people have a delay in that signal genetically. So there has to be, again, change your environment, not your willpower. There's things you can do strategically to mitigate that satiation gene. Your relationship to bitter foods, whether you like them or hate them, which really matters, because if you hate bitter foods, you will statistically eat over 100 pounds fewer vegetables per year.
Hmm.
Per year. So again, changing
Bitter. You're saying bitter. If
bitter.
you're sensitive to bitter.
Yeah, if you don't like the taste of bitter foods, I mean, think about what bitter foods are. I mean, I can show you a list here. If people are super tasters of bitters, they green leafy vegetables, chard endive artichokes, certain lettuces, arugula, kale,
Mhm.
broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, etc. There's people that are averse to these because they're sensitive to bitter. And then there's a change your environment, not your willpower. If you are like this, there are 4 separate cooking techniques to remove the bitter from these vegetables so that you can consume them. Now, again, evolutionarily, again, can you tell? I love evolutionary biology. Why are people super sensitive to bitter evolutionarily, and why are some people not?
Yeah. What's that about? Why?
So what happens is that so cranial nerve 7 innervates the front and sides of the tongue to check for sweet, sour, and salty.
Right.
Cranial nerve 9, it innervates the very back of the tongue, and it's only for bitter. So every food you eat
Hmm.
has to pass through that bitter gauntlet. And if it's too bitter, you'll retch and vomit. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Why? It actually ties back into the earlier conversation around eating unripe fruit. Most things that taste bitter will kill you. They're poisonous.
Oh boy.
So,
Listen to that, everybody. Don't eat poisonous food.
yeah, that of course. Thank you for that PSA. All right. So, but the thing is that in this kind of uh this kind of cold war between uh plants that are actually not dangerous for you but will mimic bitter foods, because there's always going to be someone that's going to like try a bitter food and they may die, or they may just open up a whole new food source. But that's the whole point. It's a risk reward ratio. People who are exquisitely sensitive to bitter are less likely to die from poisonous foods if you're foraging in the wild. But there are deeply nutritious, non-poisonous bitter foods that they are going to miss out on. So you have this, again, this dice game that evolutionary biology plays, where if you don't mind it.
Oh, you froze. You froze.
Oh, I'm here.
Yay.
But if you don't mind the taste of bitter, you are at greater risk of dying from accidentally eating something poisonous, but you are also likely to open up an entire new food source to the tribe.
Okay.
Therefore, you will be celebrated and therefore likely have more progeny for obvious reasons. If you save the tribe, you'll be rewarded in air quotes. So, so again, it's this dice game, gambling game. Some people are more sensitive and they're protected in some ways and they have problems in other ways, and other people less protected, but they have more reward in other ways. So if you know your genetics and say you're super taster and bitter, that's good to know because you may have been avoiding, really important vegetables in your life without even realizing it. So
yeah, that's interesting. And it also, when I think about vegetables, some people were never even introduced to certain vegetables their whole lives because their parents wanted peas, green beans, and corn, and that was the whole menu in my home. Growing up as a child, there was no variation, maybe an occasional piece of broccoli, but that was it.
Yeah. So we fortunately we have a lot more variety these days. And so if to me, to answer your question of like, what do I do? The first answer is, what is your foundational genetic layer? End of story, full stop. And by the way, if people are like, oh my God, genetics and testing, it sounds like a really big investment. Well, it depends on what your timeline is. Because you do the genetics test once, and the fidelity of the data doesn't decay over time, unlike a gut test, a mitochondria test, an adrenal test, a hormone test, a blood test. Because you need to recheck those every 6 to 12 months approximately. Genetics tests, you do it once, and then however much you invest in it, if you're planning on living 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 plus years, amortize whatever that initial investment is over that many decades. It's very, very little. It is the highest value test one can possibly make, and I personally think is the most important one to do because it's the foundation of everything. Functional testing comes into here with the therapeutic level or the metabolic level. So what that means is that sometimes people run their genetics testing and they figure out, say, for example, they're more on the paleo keto side of things. So they have a higher fat diet, but they still feel bad. And that may be because they have a metabolic issue blocking the metabolism of fat. They may have a gallbladder issue. They may have a lipase issue. They may have an issue with their lymphatic transport through the intestines. They may have a problem with their carnitine shuttle or their mitochondria burning fat in the beta oxidation pathway. So there's this conflict. I call it, your genetics are being wrapped in metabolic barbed wire.
Yeah.
That's how I describe it. So some people may have they'll be better off eating higher fat diet genetically, but they can't handle it metabolically. So you have to have one diet to deal with the metabolic barbed wire, and then you can switch to your genetic ideal. On the opposite end of the spectrum, it can also happen the other way. Someone can be high carb genetically, but they say have that candida infection or SIBO or whatever, and they eat high carbs and it's good, it matches them genetically, but it's going to bloom the infection. So you first deal with this metabolic barbed wire.
Yeah.
And deal with the infection first with one diet and protocols, then you can open back up the genetics. So the genetics is never bad data. You just may have things blocking you from using the data metabolically. So this type of person I just described, these are the people who say, quote, I've tried every diet and nothing works. They're not wrong. It's just that they have to deal with different diets and protocols at different stages to defang that barbed wire. And then once you deal with that, then you know what there's personal preferences that go on, if they've got cultural or religious or how they grew up in a family, like certain foods they just like or dislike, and you have to modify that according to people's needs. Access is an issue. Like not everyone lives near a farmer's market year round. People travel or are going out to a restaurant, or there's seasonal issues, or there's a drought, or there's food deserts or whatever. Access will absolutely filter down your food options or open them up depending on your access. And then the last variable in determining diet is what I call the earth layer, which is how you perceive your dietary choices affect the environment, the economy, and politics. Now, you'll notice I didn't say what philosophy, what politics, what environmental thing, because that is a moving target for everybody and it shifts over time. People make decisions based on one or more of those three variables. The problem is, I think mistakenly, people make the primary choice on their diet based on these principles. I think that's a absolutely wrong approach. I think people at a minimum should know what their genetics ideal is and then adapt their larger concerns to fit within their genetics. So
Well,
this is the big picture summary of how people can understand their diet, and especially understand their diet as it changes over time, as their metabolic needs changes, as their preferences changes, as their access changes, as their understanding of how the world around us operates. But your genes, that's the one thing that does not change.
this is so fascinating, and I cannot tell you how much I've learned as well, sitting here listening and getting all that, all the details of the importance of knowing our genetics. So with I know that I know this audience, whoever's going to be listening to this, is going to be wondering how to get in touch with you. Are you going to have the things, are they going to be able to go somewhere? Because we
Absolutely, yeah. All they have to
post all
do,
the notes and stuff
yeah.
afterwards.
It's just they just go to my website,
Okay.
www.drsamshay.com, drsamshay.com, drsamshay.com/genetics, and there's a free ebook and free mini course on genetics that they'll get in their inbox, and it includes like a link to a PDF that explains this pyramid a bit more, a whole other ebook on like the overview of genetics and inflammation. There's like the mini course also includes a bunch of other really great free resources. And if people are wanting to look at their genes individually in my particular system, and again, you can't get the carb tolerance test
Mhm.
through normal means. We're trying to onshore a U.S. lab. I right now have to send the swabs overseas to get it done, but we're trying to onshore it. We still do it. It just takes a bit longer to get it back. But
Yeah.
um, they can go to my website, and there's a Genetics Plus program, and they have a choice of a DIY or an office hours group model where there's a back end video course to support, and then on office hours I'm available at the office hours to teach, and then also answer questions for everyone's genetic concerns.
Well, I cannot thank you enough. I am so thrilled that you are so willing and generous with your time to come and talk to all of us. And I know that you're going to be back again at some point talking about the mitochondria and
Mhm.
its effect on how we eat and whatever, and our cravings. So thank you so much. And we will see you next time.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening and supporting the Professional Women's Wellness Podcast. If you would like to attend training sessions by our amazing podcast guests and have a chance to connect, join the Professional Women's Wellness newsletter. For more details and to sign up, scan the QR code or click the link in the description. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast. Each week, we will select a reviewer who will receive free access to my $197 course, Goodbye Night Bites, a 30-day journey to stop emotional eating at night. Please subscribe to get notifications of future episodes.